Think about World War II. What comes to mind? Panzer tanks rolling across fields, fighter planes dueling in the skies, and the grim, industrial reality of modern mechanized warfare. Now, try to fit another image into that picture. A British officer marching into the thick of that very same war, carrying a basket-hilted Scottish broadsword, a longbow, and a set of bagpipes. This wasn't a flight of fancy. This was a man who lived by a simple, yet utterly astonishing, personal motto. Any officer who goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed. They called him Fighting Jack Churchill, or more famously, Mad Jack. His life story feels less like a dry passage from a history book and more like the script of a blockbuster movie. This is the man who supposedly secured the last recorded longbow kill in a major war, who single-handedly captured 42 German soldiers and a mortar crew with just his sword and a corporal, and who led daring commando raids with the defiant skirl of his bagpipes, cutting through the cacophony of battle. But this isn't just a collection of eccentric anecdotes about a quirky soldier. It's a profound and almost unbelievable tale of courage, of sheer, unshakable defiance, and of the radical idea that sometimes, in the face of overwhelming industrial might, one man's unconventional spirit can become the most effective weapon on the battlefield. This is the story of Lieutenant Colonel John Malcolm Thorpe Fleming Churchill. So, how does a man end up with the audacity to charge at machine gun nests, armed with a medieval sword? To understand Jack Churchill, you have to go back to his beginning. And it wasn't in the Scottish Highlands, as his choice of weaponry might suggest. He was born in 1906 in Colombo, British Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, to an English family with a long and distinguished history of serving the Crown. His father, Alec Churchill, was a district engineer in the Ceylon Civil Service, a path his own father had trod before him. This was a world of colonial duty, adventure, and a certain expectation of service. Shortly after Jack's birth, the family moved, first briefly back to Surrey, England, and then to Hong Kong in 1910, where his father took up the prestigious post of Director of Public Works. Young Jack, along with his brothers Thomas and Robert, grew up in an environment where the British Empire was a tangible, living thing, a backdrop that fostered a spirit of exploration and self-reliance. After the family returned to England in 1917, Jack was educated at King William's College on the Isle of Man, before following the well-worn path of his class to the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. He graduated in 1926 and was promptly posted to Burma with the Manchester Regiment. For a young man brimming with a restless energy and a romantic craving for adventure, peacetime army life was intolerably dull. So, Jack sought out his own challenges. He bought a Zenith motorcycle and began a love affair with the rugged, untamed landscapes of the subcontinent. He didn't just ride, he conquered terrain. On one occasion, he drove the 500 miles from Maemyo to Rangoon, where no proper road existed. His solution was to follow the railway line, a perilous journey that involved pushing his bike along a single rail while he carefully stepped from one wooden sleeper to the next, crossing countless riverbeds and chasms. On another trip, after attending a signals course in Pune, India, he decided to ride the 1,500 miles back to Calcutta. The journey was a catalogue of breakdowns and improvisations, including an abrupt and memorable collision with a water buffalo. These weren't just joy rides, they were tests of will, exercises in pushing past limits, a theme that would define his entire life. It was also in Burma, amidst the quiet routine of colonial service, that he picked up the first of his signature instruments of war, the bagpipes. Stationed near the Cameron Highlanders, Jack became enchanted by the sound of the regimental pipe band. He arranged for lessons with the pipe major, a master of the craft. For an Englishman to take up the fiercely Scottish pipes was unusual, to say the least, but Jack Churchill had a lifelong disregard for convention. He pursued it with the same obsessive focus he applied to everything, practicing until his skill became undeniable. By 1936, a decade of an army with no war to fight was enough. He resigned his commission and hurled himself into civilian life with the same manic energy. He worked as a newspaper editor in Nairobi. His chiseled good looks landed him work as a male model, and he even found his way into the film industry as an extra. This led to a small role in the 1940 Technicolor epic, The Thief of Baghdad, a film that allowed him to showcase another of his growing passions, the longbow. On set, he didn't just act. He reportedly advised on archery techniques, already an expert in the ancient weapon. And he was far from a mere hobbyist. Jack's dedication to archery was intense. He practiced relentlessly, mastering the powerful English longbow, a weapon that demanded immense strength and precision. His skill grew to such a degree that in the summer of 1939, on the very precipice of war, he represented Great Britain at the World Archery Championships in Oslo. While he placed 26th, the very act of competing at an international level spoke volumes about his commitment. Around the same time, his piping reached a similar competitive peak. In 1938, he entered a military piping competition at the prestigious Aldershot Tattoo. He was the only Englishman among some 70 Scottish competitors, yet he walked away with second place, a stunning achievement that surely ruffled a few tartan feathers. So, on the eve of World War II, Jack Churchill was not just a soldier. He was a world-traveled adventurer, a journalist, a model, an actor, a world-class archer, and a competition-winning piper. He was, in essence, a performer who saw life as a grand stage. When Germany's invasion of Poland shattered the peace of Europe in September 1939, Jack didn't just see it as a duty to return to the army. He saw it as the ultimate adventure, the role he was born to play. He immediately rejoined his old regiment, the Manchester, ready to put his strange and wonderful collection of talents to the ultimate test. The spring of 1940 was a season of dread. The so-called phony war had shattered, and the German blitzkrieg, the lightning war, was tearing through Europe with terrifying speed. The Allied forces in France were in full chaotic retreat. The mood was one of disbelief and mounting panic as the most modern army in the world pushed the British Expeditionary Force back towards the sea. Into this maelstrom of collapsing fronts and desperate scrambles rode Captain Jack Churchill. He seemed like a figure from another time, a ghost of medieval warfare. One officer reported the surreal sight of him rattling across the fractured French countryside on a motorcycle, not with a rifle slung on his back, but with his longbow and a quiver of arrows strapped to the side. His most legendary moment of the campaign came in May 1940, near the village of Lepinette. Jack's company, part of the beleaguered rearguard, was desperately trying to slow the German advance. They set up an ambush for an approaching German patrol. As his men clutched their standard-issue Lee Enfield rifles, Jack took up his position holding his preferred weapon, the longbow. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the distant rumble of war. For Jack, this must have been a moment of pure, focused clarity, the culmination of all his practice. He watched and waited. As the German NCO leading the patrol came into view, Jack drew the bowstring back to his ear, aimed, and let an arrow fly. The bodkin-tipped arrow shot across the space between them and struck the sergeant squarely in the chest. The man crumpled to the ground without a sound. That single, silent, anachronistic act of violence was the signal. His men immediately opened fire, their rifles cracking in the suddenly broken quiet. This is the story that became the bedrock of his legend. What is widely believed to be the last recorded longbow kill by a British soldier in a major conflict. While the historical record is debated, and Jack himself later downplayed the event with classic British understatement, joking that his bows were unceremoniously run over by a lorry early in the campaign, the myth took hold and defined him. But Jack was far more than a novelty act. His courage during the desperate retreat to Dunkirk was raw and undeniable. When his commanding officer was wounded, Jack took charge of his company, a steadying presence in the chaos. At one point, his men were scrambling for cover from a German machine gun emplacement. Jack, utterly exhausted, was too tired to run. A friend later noticed blood on his ear and asked what had happened. Jack casually explained it was a nick from a German machine gun bullet. He had been too weary to duck when his men had shouted a warning. It wasn't his archery that earned him his first decoration, but his bravery. He was awarded the Military Cross for his actions near the Bethune Canal, specifically for rescuing a wounded British officer who was pinned down under heavy enemy fire. While his comrades provided covering fire, Jack ran into the open, reached the injured man, and brought him back to the relative safety of the British lines. As the Allied forces converged on the beaches of Dunkirk, the scene was apocalyptic. Hundreds of thousands of men waited under a sky black, with the smoke of burning oil refineries, enduring relentless bombardment from Stuka, dive bombers, and German artillery. The sand was littered with abandoned equipment, the wounded, and the dead. The noise was constant, a symphony of explosions, sirens, and the distant crackle of fighting. Jack and his men endured this hellish waiting room, their discipline holding firm amid the chaos. He kept their spirits up, a bulwark of defiance on the shell-pocked sands. Finally, their turn came. They waded out into the water, clambering aboard one of the little ships, or a Royal Navy vessel, and were successfully evacuated back to Britain. He had survived the catastrophic fall of France, but not before leaving his own, deeply personal and very medieval, mark on its history. After the harrowing evacuation from Dunkirk, most soldiers would have craved a long rest, a quiet posting somewhere to recover from the trauma of the retreat. Not Jack Churchill. The conventional army, with its rigid structures and peacetime habits, was an ill fit for his restless spirit. So when Prime Minister Winston Churchill called for the formation of a new elite force, the Commandos, Jack volunteered immediately. These were to be butcher and bolt units, specializing in lightning raids, sabotage, and shock tactics. Commando training, primarily in the rugged Scottish Highlands, was brutal and innovative. It weeded out all but the most physically robust and mentally resilient soldiers. Men were pushed to their absolute limits, learning to fight with near-suicidal aggression, to be self-reliant, and to think independently. For Jack, this was not a trial. It was paradise. He thrived in this environment of calculated ferocity, and his unusual skills, once seen as eccentricities, now found a perfect home. His natural leadership and theatrical flair made him stand out even among this collection of hard men. His defining Commando moment, the one that would cement his Mad Jack persona, came on December 27, 1941. Operation Archery was a major raid on the German-occupied island of Vagsø in Norway. The goal was to destroy fish oil factories vital to the German war effort and to demonstrate that Britain could still strike back. Jack was second in command of No. 3 Commando. As the flotilla of landing craft sped towards the island through the frigid Norwegian waters, the German shore batteries opened up, sending geysers of water erupting around them. Bullets stitched across the steel ramps. The tension inside the craft was unbearable. And then, over the roar of the engines and the crack of enemy fire, the German defenders heard something utterly bizarre and terrifying. It was the sound of bagpipes. Standing fully exposed at the front of the lead boat, Jack Churchill was playing March of the Cameron Men. The ramp slammed down into the icy surf, and Jack was the first man off. Still playing his pipes, he lobbed a grenade, then drew his gleaming broadsword, and, with a ferocious scream, charged onto the beach. Imagine being a German soldier, huddled in a trench, already shaken by the surprise naval bombardment, and then seeing that, a warrior from a forgotten age, in a kilt, sword in hand, charging at you to the unholy wail of the pipes. The psychological impact was devastating, sowing chaos and fear before his men had even fired a shot. Inspired by this insane, magnificent display of leadership, his commandos surged ashore behind him, a wave of unstoppable aggression. The fight for the Malloy artillery battery was fierce and at close quarters. Jack was in his element, leading from the front, his sword a blur of motion in the chaos of the gunfight. The Commandos fought their way through the German defenses with ruthless efficiency, clearing trenches and bunkers. The raid was a stunning success. The key objectives were taken, and the installations were rigged for demolition. Jack's signal back to the command ship was a masterpiece of laconic understatement. Malloy Battery and island captured. Casualties slight. Demolitions in progress. Churchill, for his extraordinary courage and leadership at WW2, he was awarded a bar to his military cross. In a typically bizarre postscript to the battle, his only injury came after the fighting had ceased. As the demolition charges began to detonate, Jack, in a moment of celebration, was opening a bottle of wine. A nearby friendly charge went off too close, and the bottle shattered, sending a shard of glass into his forehead. It was a wound he would later describe with a certain amount of pride. The WW2 raid was the perfect illustration of Jack's philosophy of war. He instinctively understood that warfare was not just a matter of logistics and firepower. It was a psychological battle. The sword, the bow, and the pipes were not just archaic props. They were tools of psychological warfare, inspiring his own men to heights of bravery and striking a primal fear into the hearts of his enemies. Among his fellow commandos, his reputation was sealed. He was seen as utterly fearless, completely unpredictable, and the sort of leader you would follow into the mouth of hell itself, if only to see what he would do next. By September 1943, the war had shifted to Italy. The Allies had invaded the mainland, with the main amphibious assault, Operation Avalanche, hitting the beaches around Salerno. The landings were a brutal, chaotic affair. Instead of the expected easy foothold, the Allied forces met ferocious German resistance. Pinned down on the narrow beachhead, they were hammered relentlessly by German artillery and mortars positioned in the hills overlooking the bay. The situation was precarious. The entire invasion hung in the balance. Into this crucible came Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill, now leading No. 2 Commando. His signature equipment was all present and accounted for. His broadsword hung at his waist, his longbow and arrows were slung over his shoulder, and his bagpipes were tucked under his arm. His commandos were tasked with a critical mission: to conduct a night raid to clear out the town of Pigoletti and the surrounding German observation posts that were directing the deadly artillery fire onto the beaches. A conventional silent attack was impossible due to the thick undergrowth. So, Jack opted for the opposite. He had his men advance in columns through the darkness, and every few minutes they let out a blood-curdling, unified shout, "Commando!" The effect on the unseen German defenders was profound. Blinded by the night and hearing these terrifying screams coming from multiple directions, they believed they were being swarmed by a massive, overwhelming force. Panic set in. The tactic worked brilliantly, and the Commandos swept through the objectives, taking 136 prisoners. But Jack's night was far from over. He learned that a key German mortar position, nestled in a heavily defended observation post, was still operational and continuing to threaten the beachhead. A full-scale assault would be costly. Jack decided to handle it himself. He chose to take only one other man, a corporal named Ruffle. This action would become the single most legendary episode of his life. Under the cloak of complete darkness, with only the distant crump of shells for accompaniment, the two men began their stalk. The terrain was treacherous, the tension immense. They moved with ghost-like silence toward the enemy post. Creeping up on the first sentries, Jack dispatched them silently with his sword, a chillingly medieval act in the midst of a modern war. He then initiated a masterful psychological game. Forcing the first few captured and terrified Germans to act as decoys, he made them approach their own comrades in the next position. The sight of their own men, held at sword point by a shadowy, menacing figure, was enough to shatter their will to fight. One by one, then in small groups, the German soldiers surrendered without a shot being fired. Jack and Corporal Ruffle moved from one weapon pit to the next, a domino-like chain of capitulation, the sheer audacity of their bluff growing with every new prisoner. The Germans, convinced they were surrounded, laid down their arms before a force of just 2 men. By the time the first hints of dawn touched the Italian hills, Jack and Corporal Ruffle marched back towards the Allied lines. Behind them trailed a column of 42 German soldiers, carrying their own wounded and their heavy mortar equipment. The sight was surreal. Jack himself later remarked that the procession coming down the pass was an image from the Napoleonic Wars. When they arrived back at the Commando lines, the reaction was one of utter disbelief, followed by thunderous admiration. With nothing more than a sword, a single corporal, and an extraordinary amount of nerve, Jack had eliminated a major threat to the Salerno beachhead and saved countless lives. For this breathtaking act of courage and cunning, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Order, DSO, one of Britain's highest decorations for gallantry. The official citation praised his outstanding leadership and courage. But for the men on the ground, it was something more. It was proof that Mad Jack Churchill wasn't just mad. He was a genius of a very particular, very dangerous kind. In 1944, with Italy largely secured, Jack and his commandos were dispatched to a different kind of war. They were sent to the rugged Adriatic coast of Yugoslavia to support Marshal Tito's partisans. This was a brutal, shadowy guerrilla war fought against elite German mountain troops, a conflict of ambushes, raids, and savage reprisals. In May 1944, Jack was tasked with leading a major assault on the German-held island of Brach. His force was a complex mix of his own number. 2 Commando, elements of 43 Commando, and a large contingent of Yugoslav partisans, a challenging command dynamic under any circumstances. The initial landings on the island were successful and met with little opposition, but the true test came the following day. Jack was to lead a small, elite group of his own commandos in an attack against Point 622, a heavily fortified German position high in the island's rocky interior. As they advanced up the exposed slopes, they were spotted. The world erupted. Intense and accurate mortar and machine gun fire tore into them from all sides. The assault immediately stalled as men were cut down, seeking whatever meager cover they could find among the rocks. As his men fell around him, with the attack faltering and communications breaking down, Jack Churchill did the only thing that made sense to him in that moment of supreme chaos. He took out his bagpipes. Standing amidst the maelstrom of bullets and shrapnel, he began to play "Will Ye No Come Back Again?" A defiant, sorrowful, and utterly courageous attempt to rally his shattered force for one last effort. But this time, there would be no miraculous victory. As the haunting notes of the pipes echoed across the blood-soaked hillside, a German grenade exploded just feet from where he stood. The blast threw him violently to the ground, knocking him unconscious. When Jack's consciousness slowly returned, the world was silent save for the ringing in his ears. He blinked, tasting dust and blood. He was surrounded. German soldiers were standing over him, their rifles pointed down. He looked around. His men were all gone, killed or wounded. He was the last one. His defiant song had been silenced, and he was now a prisoner of war. His captors, upon discovering his name, Churchill, immediately suspected he might be a relative of the British Prime Minister. This misunderstanding, born of coincidence, almost certainly saved his life. Under Hitler's infamous Commando Order of 1942, any captured commando was to be executed without trial. But the potential value of a relative of Winston Churchill meant Jack was a special case. Instead of a summary execution on a Yugoslavian hillside, he was flown to Berlin for direct interrogation by German military intelligence. They questioned him extensively, trying to determine his connection to the Prime Minister, a connection Jack did nothing to deny. Though his luck on the battlefield had finally run out, his name had bought him a chance at survival. He was sent not to a standard POW camp, but to the special prominent prisoners compound within the notorious Sachsenhausen concentration camp. Even in defeat, his final conscious act on the battlefield had been one of utter defiance, a lone piper playing against the thunder of the guns. For most men, being imprisoned in a Nazi concentration camp like Sachsenhausen, just north of Berlin, would be the end of the story, a grim sentence of survival. For Jack Churchill, it was just another challenge, another adventure. The camp was a brutal place, but the special compound where he was held with other high-value prisoners afforded slightly better conditions, though the threat of execution was ever present. For Jack, confinement was an intolerable state. An adventurer's spirit cannot be caged. In September 1944, he put his restless energy to use. Along with a Royal Air Force officer, Bertram James, who had been a survivor of the Great Escape, Jack planned a breakout. Their method was simple, claustrophobic, and daring. They discovered an old, disused drain pipe that ran under the camp's inner wall, the electrified fence, and the outer wall. One night, they made their move, crawling through the narrow, filth-ridden pipe and emerging into the darkness of the German countryside. Their audacious plan was to walk the hundreds of miles north to the Baltic coast, where they hoped to find passage to neutral Sweden. They traveled by night, stealing vegetables from fields to survive. But their luck didn't hold. After several days on the run, they were recaptured near the coastal city of Rostock, just a few kilometers short of the sea. As punishment, Jack was transferred to another, supposedly more secure, POW camp in Tyrol, Austria. He arrived there as the war was grinding towards its chaotic conclusion. In April 1945, the camp's administration began to break down. The guards were nervous, the infrastructure failing. One evening, the camp's electrical system failed, plunging the entire area into absolute darkness and confusion. For Jack, this was not a problem. It was an engraved invitation. While others huddled in the confusion, Jack simply seized the opportunity. He slipped away from his work detail, melted into the shadows, and just walked away. He was free, but his situation was incredibly perilous. He was alone, deep in enemy territory, with the formidable barrier of the Alps standing between him and the Allied lines in Italy. What followed was an epic journey of survival. For 8 days, Jack walked, covering an astonishing 150 miles across the snow-capped mountains. He was a solitary figure, navigating by the sun and stars, his determination his only compass. Survival was a daily, brutal struggle. He slept in abandoned barns or rough on the frozen ground. His diet consisted of whatever he could steal from farm gardens: onions, potatoes, anything to keep him going. He carried with him a rusty tin can, his only piece of equipment, which he used to cook his meager rations over small, concealed fires. He had to constantly be on guard for German patrols or suspicious locals. His body was pushed to the brink by exhaustion and malnutrition. His ankles sprained, but his spirit refused to break. Finally, after more than a week in the wilderness, he descended into the Brenner Pass, the historic route between Austria and Italy. From a hiding place, he spotted an armored column on the road below. He watched, heart pounding, holding his breath. Were they German or Allied? The suspense was agonizing. Then he saw a soldier get out of one of the vehicles, stretch, and pull out a pack of American cigarettes. Jack knew he was safe. He walked out of the trees, a ragged, gaunt figure, and met the American troops. Their reaction was one of bewilderment at this disheveled Englishman who claimed to have just walked out of a Nazi camp and over the Alps. His long, arduous journey to freedom was finally over. Jack Churchill returned to a Britain celebrating the end of the war in Europe. For him, the news was bittersweet. His thirst for action was unquenched. He immediately had himself sent to Burma, where the fight against the Japanese Empire was still raging. However, by the time he arrived in the theater, the world had been irrevocably changed. The atomic bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Japan's surrender was imminent. The war was over. Jack was famously and characteristically disappointed. In a remark that perfectly captured his warrior spirit, he complained to a friend, "If it wasn't for those damned Yanks, we could have kept the war going another 10 years." The end of global conflict, however, couldn't stop a man like Jack. In an army now at peace, he continued to seek out challenges. He qualified as a parachutist at the age of 40, adding another skill to his eclectic resume. In 1948, he was posted to British Mandate Palestine as the second-in-command of the 1st Battalion, the Highland Light Infantry. He was once again thrust into conflict during the tragic Hadassah Medical Convoy Massacre. When a convoy of Jewish doctors, nurses, and students came under attack by Arab forces, Jack, against orders to stay out of the fight, rushed to the scene. He and his 12 men provided covering fire, and he personally stood before the attackers, trying to reason with them. Though he couldn't prevent the massacre, he then coordinated the successful evacuation of over 700 Jewish doctors, patients, and students from the besieged Hadassah Hospital, another act of personal bravery in the face of chaos. After Palestine, his career took another surprising turn. He was posted to Australia, serving as an instructor at a land-air warfare school. It was there, on the sun-drenched beaches down under, that he discovered a new passion: surfing. Upon his return to England, he brought this new obsession with him. In July 1955, locals on the banks of the River Severn were stunned to see a man paddle a huge custom-made surfboard into the river to face its famous 5-foot tidal bore. He became the first person to ever surf the powerful river wave, riding it for over a mile and adding another first to his legend. Jack finally retired from the Army in 1959, but his eccentric flair never faded. He settled into a quieter life, but retained his love for the theatrical. Taking a desk job, he commuted daily by train. For years, he startled fellow passengers and the train conductor with a bizarre ritual. At a precise moment on his journey home, he would stand up, open the window, and hurl his briefcase out of the moving train. His explanation was perfectly logical, if entirely unusual. He had timed it perfectly to throw the case directly into his own backyard, saving him the trouble of carrying it home from the station. He also took up sailing radio-controlled model warships on the Thames and refurbished old steamboats, never losing his childlike sense of play and adventure. Mad Jack Churchill passed away peacefully in Surrey in 1996, at the age of 89. He was a highly decorated war hero, holding both the Distinguished Service Order and the Military Cross and Bar. But he was so much more than the sum of his medals. He was a vibrant, unapologetic symbol of individualism in an age of increasingly anonymous, industrialized warfare. His story is a wild, magnificent, and joyous reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapons on any battlefield are courage, showmanship, and a glorious, undeniable touch of madness. Mad Jack Churchill proved that one unconventional spirit can change the course of a war. What other forgotten World War II heroes deserve their story told? Drop your suggestions below. And if you know someone who needs to hear about the man who brought a sword to a world war, share this video with them. These stories deserve to be remembered,